Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is EPA's new 2021 Multi-Sector General Permit for Industrial Stormwater Discharges webinar. I'm Caitlin Ellsworth with the Eastern Research Group, a contractor to the US EPA, and I'm helping to support today's webinar. With us today are speakers from the US EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Emily Halter-Anwari is on the Stormwater team, and she leads the National Industrial Stormwater Program. She joined EPA's Office of Wastewater Management in 2013 and holds an MA in Environmental Resource Policy from George Washington University and a BA in Economics from Virginia Tech. Alicia Denning recently joined the Stormwater team. She joined EPA's Office of Pesticides Program in 2017 before eventually joining the Office of Wastewater Management in July of 2020. She holds a Bachelor of Chemical Engineering from Auburn University. And we also have Rachel Urban with us, who's going to help with the Q&A session following the conclusion of the presentation, and she leads the Stormwater team. She's been in the EPA's Office of Wastewater Management since 2005 and holds an MS in Marine Estuarine Environmental Sciences and a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources Management, both from the University of Maryland. I'm going to turn it over to Emily Halter from EPA to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you to all of our attendees for being here today. I see we're approaching almost 900 folks, so we're really happy that everyone could join us. Probably like many of you, EPA is still working from home, and for me it's coming up on a year ago that I gave my first presentation from home, which was on the proposed MSGP. So our whole team today is coming to you live from our respective home offices. So as Caitlin mentioned, please bear with us through any technical difficulties. Obviously, today we're going to be talking about the new 2021 Multi-Sector General Permit for Industrial Stormwater Discharges. We have a lot to cover, so let's get into it. So first, just a disclaimer that the language in this presentation is not the official permit. We've attempted to be as accurate as possible, of course, in the presentation, but if there are any differences or discrepancies between the language in this presentation and the permit is the document that governs. This presentation is a summary of the key requirements and the permit changes, but it is not a substitute for reading and understanding the permit, and it is not an exhaustive end-to-end description of everything that's required in the permit. So just keep that in mind as we're going through the presentation. So as I mentioned, what's ahead today is talking about the Industrial Stormwater Program background. I'll talk about the proposed permit and the final permit. And then the substance of this presentation will be the basic permit parts and the new requirements in the 2021 MSGP. And I'm going to talk about the permit and the new requirements in these four buckets, sort of preparing for permit coverage, getting covered, checking up, and then the follow-up. So that's the context for what we're talking about today. So how does EPA regulate industrial stormwater discharges? So as you can see from this three-tiered graphic, there are three levels to our regulatory structure for these type of discharges. The first at the bottom, the dark green, is the statute or the law, the Clean Water Act, in which Congress directed EPA to regulate industrial stormwater discharges through NPDES permits. In addition, the Clean Water Act tells us that these discharges must meet water quality standards. The next level up is our regulations, and in the regulations, they define the term stormwater discharges associated with industrial activity. And the regulations also name the 11 categories of industrial activity that should be regulated. And lastly, at the top of the triangle, which most folks are probably familiar with, is the permit, the Multi-Sector General Permit, which is the vehicle that authorizes the stormwater discharges, and it also sets forth the specific requirements for those operators. These pieces are all related because the permit implements the regulations and the regulations implement the statute. I also want to note that the 2021 MSGP is the 5th iteration, of this permit. There is an exception or an exclusion from industrial stormwater permitting, and it's called a conditional exclusion for no exposure. You might be familiar with the term NOE for no exposure, which we recently transitioned to using the acronym NEC for no exposure certification. So the exclusion is available if all of your industrial materials and activities are protected by a storm-resistant shelter to prevent exposure to precipitation and runoff. You would need to make sure that you qualified for the exclusion by reviewing the qualifying conditions in the regulations there, 40 CFR 122.26G, and by also submitting a no exposure certification online through our submission system called the NPDES e-reporting tool, or NET MSGP, and that would be submitted every 5 years. The submission of a no exposure certification is unaffected by the MSGP reissuance timeline because it is an exclusion from permitting. And now I'm going to hand it off to webinar.
Okay, so here you can see a map of where this MSGP applies. It covers some entire areas seen in teal here. So these that are in teal. So you got New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New Mexico, and Idaho. However, in July of this year, Idaho will receive its NPDES permitting authority, and when that happens, we will help permittees transfer their coverage. The MSGP also applies in DC and Puerto Rico. It applies in U.S. territories, and then it also applies partially in some areas that are kind of in this lighter gray area, so in federal facilities in Vermont and Delaware, as well as Colorado and Washington, and then it applies in some oil and gas facilities. It also covers most Indian country lands. So can you click next slide, Emily? So we anticipate about 2,400 facilities to be covered by this permit in the areas that were just mentioned. This slide shows data from the 2015 MSGP and illustrates kind of a distribution of facilities covered by the MSGP and their locations. As you can see here, most facilities are in Massachusetts and New Mexico, with a significant amount in Puerto Rico and New Hampshire and Idaho, but it covers all of the areas that you just saw on the map. Next slide. So the MSGP covers a wide variety of industrial activities, which are categorized by 29 sectors, and each sector has its own SIC code. MSGP coverage is typically concentrated in land transportation, mineral mining, scrap recycling, glass, clay, and cement, and air transportation. And I'll hand it back over to you, Emily, to finish this off.
Thanks, Alicia. So now that EPA has reissued our MSGP, I do get a lot of questions about the effect of EPA's permit on state MSGPs. And I'm guessing a lot of our audience members are covered by EPA's MSGP, but I'm guessing that a lot of them aren't, and you're in other areas that aren't covered by EPA's MSGP. And folks ask, hey, I'm not under EPA's permit. Will I need to comply with the new requirements? Or will my state permit change to match EPA's permit? And the short answer is no. State permits don't need to incorporate any of EPA's new requirements that we finalized in our MSGP, but they may if they choose to. And facilities in areas where EPA is not the permitting authority don't need to comply with this permit. However, we previously evaluated the similarities between EPA's 2015 MSGP and other state MSGPs and found that there were a number of state permits that were substantially similar or somewhat similar, as you can see here from this pie chart on the slide. So we can't say for sure what states will do, but we do recognize that there are a number of states that model their permit after ours. So my recommendation for folks that aren't covered by this permit but are wondering about what their state permits will do is to keep engaged in the proposal and reissuance process for your state MSGP to monitor what changes they may be considering for a future permit. The evaluation that we conducted is available in the docket for this permit, and I've put the document number down at the bottom under the pie chart. So now moving deeper into the permit itself. A quick background for the proposed permit, which you may remember if you attended the webinar for the proposal, is that we had a settlement agreement from the previous permit, the 2015 MSGP, that was signed in 2016 with all involved parties. That settlement agreement had a number of terms that EPA had to include in the next proposed MSGP, which was for the proposal for this permit, which EPA fulfilled at that time. One of the key terms from that agreement was that EPA would fund a study conducted by the National Research Council or National Academies of Sciences on possible improvements to the industrial stormwater program. EPA considered all of the NRC recommendations in the proposal, some of which informed a few of the requirements that we ultimately finalized in the permit. I put a link to the study on the slide, and the study is also on our website, and you can also Google it to easily find it that way. So the permit was proposed back in the spring for a 90-day comment period. We received almost 1,800, 1,900 individual comments on the proposal, which were carefully reviewed and considered for the final permit. The permit was recently signed last month on January 15th, and the permit will be effective on March 1st, 2021. The permit documents are available on our website now at the link that I provided on the website. And the rest of the record, including response to comments, will be available on the docket when the Federal Register notice publishes, which I just learned will be tomorrow, February 19th. So everyone is not left wondering until the end of the presentation. I wanted to quickly note a few key things that were in the proposal, but that were not finalized as proposed in the final permit. So the first one that we considered in the proposal was an expansion of the eligibility criterion for circle sites outside of EPA Region 10. That was an existing requirement for facilities in Region 10, but we did not expand that eligibility requirement. We had also considered an eligibility criterion regarding the use of coal tar seal coat, which we did not finalize. There was a consideration for extending the authorization wait time for facilities that had a pending enforcement action. We also considered in the proposal providing an inspection-only option in lieu of benchmark monitoring for certain facilities. There was also a consideration of benchmark monitoring for sectors I, R, and P, and also universal benchmarks for all sectors, all of which were not finalized. We also considered modifying the method for determining natural background pollutant levels. That was different from the way it was in the 2015 MSGP. And we also considered requiring the use of sector-specific stormwater control measures in an Appendix Q, all of which were not finalized as proposed. Before I get into the permit requirements and changes, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about key deadlines up front. So depending on if you're an existing facility or a facility that has been operating under the No Action Assurance Memo, or if you're a new facility, your deadlines will differ. So for existing facilities, your notice of intent or the form you need to submit to get covered under the permit, which I'll talk about in more details in a minute, those NOIs are due by May 30th, 2021. And obviously, I'm going to recommend that you get it in well before that deadline because that's the last day that you'll be able to get it in if you want to renew your coverage on time. But that is the last day of the grace period under the new permit. And your first monitoring period will begin in July, so that's listed here, and here. For new facilities, you have different deadlines. So your deadlines are based on when you plan to commence discharging. You'll need to submit your NOI at least 30 days prior to when you commence discharging, and your first monitoring period will begin the first full quarter after you get covered. So for example, if you receive coverage in April this year, your first monitoring period will begin in July, and if you get covered in August, your first monitoring period will begin in October. And for everybody, there is an annual report that's due January 30th of each year. So for everyone that gets covered this year, your first annual report will be due January 30th of the following year, 2022. This date here. Okay, let's get into the requirements of the permit. The basic requirements and structure of the permit remain unchanged from the previous permit, although we have moved a couple parts around a little bit. It might be helpful to think about the permit in these 4 categories that I mentioned before. So prepare, get covered, checking up, and then following up. Some of these activities are ongoing requirements as indicated by this symbol here. And I've put that on each of these that have the ongoing requirement. So I briefly want to talk about what's in each of these categories. So for prepare, the first thing you want to do is check your eligibility conditions. You also need to develop or update your SWIP, your Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, and also install the control measures that you'll use to meet the effluent limits to comply with the permit. For getting covered, you need to submit your notice of intent for authorization. Activities that involve checking up on your compliance include conducting inspections and visual assessments and conducting various types of required monitoring. And then follow-up actions include any required corrective actions and additional implementation measures, and then completing any required reporting. Other things to consider are there are also requirements that are potentially cross-cut each of these categories. And those are the sector-specific requirements in Part 8 and the state and tribal-specific conditions in Part 9. So even though EPA is the permitting authority for these areas, states and tribes, for example, the state of Massachusetts or New Mexico, they do submit state-specific conditions that permittees in those areas need to comply with. And these parts are part of the permit, so they should not be overlooked. So now I'm going to talk about each of these individual sections, and when I go over each section, I'll talk about the new requirements that are in each part. So first we have preparing. As I mentioned, one of the first things that's part of preparing for the permit is to make sure that you can use it. There are several eligibility conditions for this permit that you may consider, among other things. The first is making sure that you're located in an area where EPA is the permitting authority. Alicia showed you the map of where this permit applies earlier in the presentation. And those areas are listed out in detail in Appendix C. So make sure that you are located in one of those areas to be able to be eligible for this permit. The second thing is making sure that your discharge is a stormwater discharge associated with industrial activity, or we also cover certain non-stormwater discharges authorized by this permit. For example, if you have a wastewater discharge, that is not covered by this permit. Or if you have a stormwater discharge mixed with a wastewater discharge, that is also not covered by this permit. Those will be permitted separately under different NPDES permits. So this permit is only for stormwater discharges from industrial activity. Another thing under the eligibility conditions is that certain new facilities have restrictions. For example, if you're discharging into an impaired receiving water or high quality water. Also facilities in EPA Region 10 that are discharging to specific CERCLA sites or Superfund sites have a few restrictions. Also, there are requirements to meet related to the protection of historic properties and endangered species. So these are all part of the eligibility conditions that need to be met prior to getting covered under the permit. The next step in preparing to get covered by the permit is to develop or update your SWIP. And this is We usually call this the SWIP, but some people do call it the SWPPP or the SWP3, but EPA tends to refer to it as the SWIP, so that's what you're going to hear from me during the presentation. So your SWIP is how you will plan to comply with the permit. It's your living roadmap where you keep and update all the information throughout your permit coverage. The SWIP is required to be developed prior to getting covered, so you can set yourself up for a successful industrial stormwater management program before you even get covered by the permit. You also will need to post your SWIP publicly, and you have 3 options for that. You can attach it to your NOI when you submit it online. You can include a URL if you post it on your own website in the NOI, or you can provide pertinent information in the NOI from your SWIP. You could copy and paste it in text boxes in your NOI. Part 6 of the permit details what needs to be included in the SWIP, including details about your stormwater pollution prevention plan team, a description of your site, a summary of your potential pollutant sources, description of your controls, schedule and procedures for things like visual assessments, inspections and monitoring. And then you'll also need the documentation to support your eligibility pertaining to those other federal laws that I mentioned, including protecting historic properties and endangered species. And then there are some signature requirements for the SWIP. So again, this is in part 6 of the permit, and it's all detailed out. We are developing and updating a SWIP guide and a SWIP template. I've gotten a number of emails about that already, and we hope to be able to post that online in a couple of weeks, shortly after the permit becomes effective. So another critical and substantive part of this permit, and one you need to prepare for, is installing the control measures to meet the effluent limits of the permit. There are 2 types of effluent limits in this permit. One is a technology-based permit, and one is a water quality-based permit. So under your water quality-based effluent limits, So under your tech-based limits, they include the actual stormwater control measures, such as those named here, like minimizing exposure, your good housekeeping, maintenance, spill prevention, E&S control, things like employee training, and evaluating your non-stormwater discharges. These are all sections in Part 2 of the permit that require stormwater control measures that you'll need to comply with. And I mentioned earlier that the Clean Water Act directed EPA to regulate industrial stormwater discharges and that they needed to meet water quality standards. And that's where this water quality-based effluent limit comes from. So discharges must be controlled to meet water quality standards, and compliance with the permit requirements, the full compliance with the permit requirements assumes compliance with this part. I also wanted to mention under technology-based effluent limits, which I was meant to mention before, is that in addition to the stormwater control measures, there are also numeric effluent limits for certain facilities. And those are annual, they're called numeric effluent limits or effluent limitation guidelines, ELG, and those are numeric limits that require annual monitoring for certain facilities. And I'll talk more about monitoring later in the permit. And just as a reminder, this is an ongoing activity, so you may need to continue to assess your control measures throughout coverage, like during inspections, or if there's a control that's not working, and you may need to take corrective action if necessary to fix it. So it's not a one and done thing. This is kind of something that you need to prepare for and monitor, and keep these updated and maintained throughout your permit coverage to make sure they're controlling your discharges. So this is the first slide that discusses a new requirement in a permit. These slides show the equivalent requirement for the 2015 MSGP here on the left, if there is one, and the new requirement in the 2021 MSGP on the right. So that's where this is. And also included the part number up here, so you have the reference for the new requirement. For this new requirement, operators must consider implementing enhanced stormwater control measures, such as structural improvements, enhanced resilient pollution prevention measures to minimize the impacts from stormwater discharges from major storm events, such as hurricanes, storm surge, historic flood events. And some examples of this are elevating materials, maybe reducing your outdoor storage, delaying deliveries, tying things down when you know there's going to be a flood event, things like that. I want to emphasize that operators are not required to implement the example controls that are given here or in the permit, but you are required to consider the benefit of selecting and designing control measures that reduce the risk to your industrial facility and the potential impacts from stormwater discharges caused by these major storm events. So you should document in your SWIP how you've considered these factors in the selection and design of your controls. Okay, next section is getting covered. So how do you actually get covered by this permit? So hopefully existing permittees are familiar with the system called Net MSGP, but for those who aren't, you need to electronically submit your notice of intent or NOI through EPA's electronic system called the NPDES e-reporting tool, or Net MSGP for short. So the NOI contains facility discharge information, information about protecting endangered species and historic properties, also information about your SWIP that I mentioned before. So this is a screenshot of what the Net MSGP dashboard looks like. It's really user-friendly, and you can submit, I'll talk about reporting later, but through this system you can submit your NOI, you can submit a change NOI, notice of termination, your annual report. There are a bunch of different reporting features that are in Net MSGP. So as a reminder, when your NOIs are due, like I said, existing facilities are due by May 30th of this year, and new facilities, remember, your NOIs are due 30 days prior to commencing your discharges. I also wanted to let you know that we do have a very robust help desk and training and tutorials that are available through this link that I provided on the slide, and it's also linked on our website. So if you do have issues, our team is here, and we also have a help desk that you can call or email at any time, and they will help you through any technical issues with getting registered or submitting any forms, things like that. So please take advantage of that if you do need assistance. A new requirement in this section of the permit is a public signage requirement. So public signage helps interested parties to be better informed and educated about how to obtain the facility SWIP, which is public information, and how to contact the facility and EPA. Signage at facilities will also increase public awareness of those facilities that have coverage under this permit. So for this requirement, there wasn't an equivalent requirement in the previous MSGP, but this type of requirement is found in other permits, the construction general permit and other NPDES permits. So for the requirement, facilities need to post a sign of permit coverage at a safe and publicly accessible location near their facility, and the sign needs to include things about the facility, such as contact information, how to obtain the SWIP, and also how to contact EPA. Important though to note is that there is an exception if you have like a local law or ordinance that prohibits this type of signage in the right of way or near your property, for instance. So there is some flexibility in that. And this is just an example of the sign. It is detailed in part 1.3.5, but I made a mock-up just so folks can see what the sign contents should look like. So you need to say that your facility is permitted under this permit for industrial stormwater discharges. You need to give your NPDES ID, which you will obtain once you submit your NOI. That's generated through the Net MSGP website. Also, contact for your facility. If you have your SWIP posted on a URL, or you can, there is an option in the permit to have the name of the regional EPA person, so a member of the public could contact the EPA and EPA could request it from you. And then also a number for the EPA regional office for any observations of stormwater pollution. Okay, so checking up. There are two parts to checking up in the permit, and the first is conducting inspections and visual assessments. So for inspections, inspections need to be conducted by a qualified personnel, which is defined in the permit. So it is a specific person that has the appropriate knowledge and skills to conduct those inspections. And those need to be done quarterly for the entire permit term or your entire permit coverage. The permit does specify the specific areas that need to be inspected and what to look for. And then you also need to complete and sign an inspection report each time. So remember, these are done quarterly, so it is a reoccurring activity throughout your permit coverage. The other activity, which is in Part 3 of the permit, is the visual assessment. So you do need to conduct quarterly visual assessments, which is different from your quarterly inspection. This is a grab sample from each of your discharge points, and you need to collect that within the first 30 minutes of a storm event if possible. There are a number of things that the permit specifies to look for: oil sheen, solids, things like that, clarity, and you need to document your results in a visual assessment report. This is also ongoing because it is quarterly throughout the permit term. Here are a couple of examples of what to look for during inspection. So you're going to look for poor housekeeping, things like trash all around your site. Look for evidence of spills or leaks. Also, if there are exposure of potential pollutants, you want to make sure that you manage that. And also look for unauthorized non-stormwater discharges. So these are things like other wastewater discharges that wouldn't be authorized under this permit. The other activity that is under the sort of the umbrella of checking up is conducting required monitoring. I know this slide is a little dense, but don't worry, I'm going to talk through each of these things. So there are various types of monitoring required under this permit, but don't be too overwhelmed because this list doesn't apply to all facilities. So some of which of this monitoring is new or modified, and I'll go through each of these. Each of the changes to these types of monitoring in the preceding slides. So the first type of monitoring that we have, and this is in Part 4 of the permit and also in Part 8 under the sector-specific requirements. The first type of monitoring we have, which is new, is called indicator monitoring. And indicator monitoring there are two types. One is quarterly for pH, TSS, and COD for all facilities that didn't have benchmarks. And that means about 45% of the facilities. And this is required quarterly throughout permit coverage. The second type of indicator monitoring is for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And this is for certain facilities, and I'll talk about who those facilities are. And this will be biannually, so twice a year, but only in your first year of permit coverage and your fourth year of permit coverage. Both of these types of indicator monitoring are report only. So that means there's no threshold and there's no follow-up. There's no violation based on the value that you get. So we're just reporting the values under these types of monitoring. The second type of monitoring that we have, which many folks are probably familiar with, is benchmark monitoring. This is quarterly and it's sector specific, which is noted in Part 8. And it will be in at least your first year of permit coverage and your fourth year of permit coverage. This schedule is a change from what we had under the previous permit, and I'll talk through that in more detail. There is no violation for an exceedance of the benchmark value, but unlike indicator monitoring, there is a follow-up procedure that is required if there is an exceedance, and there is continued monitoring required if there is an exceedance. The follow-up protocol for benchmark monitoring is now called Additional Implementation Measures, or AIM, and I'll talk more about that in detail shortly. The other type of monitoring that we have is the Effluent Limitation Guidelines monitoring. This is the numeric tech-based limits that I talked about a couple of slides ago. This is annual monitoring, so just once per year for facilities that are subject to the ELG, or the Effluent Limitation Guideline. And those facilities are detailed out in Part 423 of the permit. So It depends on if there was a numeric ELG developed for your facility or not. It's very specific. The exceedance does require follow-up monitoring and an exceedance report, and an ELG is considered a violation, which is different from these other two. The other main type of monitoring that is under this permit is called impaired waters monitoring, particularly for those that are discharging to waters without a total maximum daily load, or a TMDL. So for those discharges, annual monitoring is required in the first year of permit coverage for all pollutants that are causing the impairment. And if the pollutant is not detected, then monitoring can be discontinued until your fourth year of permit coverage, when a subset of pollutants is required. And these are both annual samples, so just one per year. And like I mentioned, if the pollutant is not detected, then monitoring can be discontinued. However, if the pollutant is detected, then continued monitoring will be required. And then lastly, definitely check Part 9 for your state or tribal specific requirements, because sometimes those state and tribes do require additional monitoring. So you'll always want to look at Part 9 to make sure that you have all your monitoring requirements covered. So the first major change for the monitoring section in the 2021 MSGP has to do with the indicator monitoring that I mentioned, which is new to this permit. So like I mentioned, facilities without sector-specific benchmarks need to conduct indicator monitoring for pH, TSS, and COD. In a previous permit, benchmark monitoring was the only type of monitoring that was applied besides the ELG monitoring and the impaired waters monitoring. So we didn't have this type of indicator monitoring before. And benchmark monitoring was only applying to about half of the MSGP facilities, and that meant that the other half really weren't conducting any type of monitoring to check on the quality of their discharge, the characterization of their discharges, and the effectiveness of their stormwater controls. So for this permit, we do have a new requirement that facilities without benchmarks must conduct report-only indicator monitoring for these three parameters, pH, TSS, and COD, on a quarterly basis throughout the permit term. And I listed here which subsectors this applies to. The reason that we have this new change in the permit is because these three indicator monitoring parameters provide a sort of baseline and comparable understanding of industrial stormwater discharge quality, like I mentioned. They're also indicators of potential water quality problems, stormwater control effectiveness. For these operators who were only conducting visual monitoring and collecting little, if any, numeric data on the performance of their control measures to ensure compliance with water quality standards. So we feel this is important type of monitoring that needs to be included in the permit. Like I mentioned before, there is another type of indicator monitoring for pHs. There wasn't an equivalent requirement under the 2015 MSGP. For this requirement, it does apply differently than the other indicator monitoring. So this requirement is for certain facilities that are named here under these sectors. And they must conduct report-only indicator monitoring. So the same, there's just reporting of the value for pHs on a twice per year basis in the first year of permit coverage and the fourth year of permit coverage. And it applies to any facility that's going to use coal tar seal coat, also sector facilities in Sector A who store or use creosote, SIC code 2911 in Sector C, and then facilities in Sector D, F, H, I, M, O, 3 different SIC codes in Sector P, 4493 SIC code in Sector Q, and then facilities in Sector R and Sector S. And this is all detailed out in the permit itself in Part 4211. So another change that we had for monitoring is updating the benchmark values in the permit. So in the 2015 MSGP, a number of parameters that we identified that were based on outdated water quality criteria and or toxicity data were selenium, arsenic, aluminum, cadmium, magnesium, iron, and copper. And so based on a number of factors, especially new final EPA water quality criteria, we've made a couple of changes with these parameters. We revised the aluminum benchmark value, also the copper freshwater value, selenium freshwater value, and the cadmium value. We've also removed iron and magnesium as benchmarks due to lack of documented toxicity. So we, a couple of sectors got some of their benchmarks dropped. And then we also are allowing facilities to conduct a site-specific risk analysis for aluminum and copper benchmark exceedances. And this is actually, when I talk more about additional implementation measures, or AIM, which is the follow-up procedures for benchmark exceedances, this is going to be one of the exceptions under that protocol. One of the other changes that we had to monitoring is updating the benchmark monitoring schedule, like I alluded to before. So in the 2015 MSGP, benchmark monitoring was required, but it was only required quarterly for the first 4 quarters. And if the annual average was below the benchmark threshold or the value, then facilities could discontinue benchmark monitoring for that parameter for the remainder of their coverage. In the 2021 MSGP, we took a little bit different approach. Benchmark monitoring is required now in quarterly in the first 4 quarters, just as it was before. If the annual average is below the benchmark, facilities can discontinue until the 4th year of permit coverage. So now, previously they could discontinue for the whole permit term. Now you can discontinue just until the 4th year of permit coverage when your quarterly monitoring is required again. And if monitoring has an exceedance, then AIM is triggered. Requiring monitoring twice during the permit term just allows for better characterization of the industrial stormwater discharge and the industrial stormwater control performance like throughout the permit instead of just right on the front end and then discontinuing for the remainder of permit coverage. When you may not know potentially what's going on with your control measures after that first year. And the last change that we have under monitoring has to do with monitoring for impaired waters without a TMDL. So in the 2015 MSGP, operators discharging to impaired waters had to monitor once per year, so 1 sample for the first year for all pollutants causing the impairment. And they could discontinue that monitoring if the pollutant was not detected or not expected in the discharge. So for the 2021 MSGP, we took a similar approach which tried to mirror the schedule of the benchmark monitoring. So you kind of see this first year and 4th year schedule pop up again in this type of monitoring. So these facilities now need to monitor once in the first year of coverage for all pollutants causing impairment. So the same that they had to do under the 2015 MSGP. But then they also need to monitor once in the 4th year for only those pollutants that are associated with industrial activity and or are benchmarks and are also causing pollutants, also causing an impairment in the water. So potentially you are narrowing the list of pollutants that you need to monitor for again in that 4th year. If the pollutants are not detected, then you can discontinue for the remainder of permit coverage. And monitoring must be continued if detected. So if it's detected in the first year, you need to continue monitoring. And then you also need to continue monitoring if it's detected in the 4th year. So requiring, again, similarly to benchmark monitoring, requiring monitoring in years 1 and 4 allows for a periodic check on the operator's potential contribution to these impairments during the permit coverage. Oops, wrong way. Okay, here we go. So moving on to sort of the last umbrella of actions under the permit are the follow-up actions. Your follow-up actions include completing any required corrective action or additional implementation measures, and also completing reporting. So we're going to talk about corrective actions, and then I'm going to spend a couple slides talking about additional implementation measures because that is new under the permit. So corrective action is required if any of these certain conditions occur, and this is in part 5.1. So if you have an authorized release or discharge, if you exceed an ELG, if you have controls that are not working or not stringent enough to meet water quality standards, or if you have a visual assessment that shows evidence of stormwater pollution, these conditions are detailed out in the permit. And if any of those occur, you need to review and revise your SWIP and take immediate action until you can implement a permanent solution. And there are certain deadlines associated with the actions, notably that you need to take that action within 14 days. And like I said, it is detailed out in part 5.1 of the permit. The other follow-up protocol that we have under this permit is for benchmark monitoring, and it's only for benchmark monitoring. So not for indicator monitoring, not for impaired waters monitoring, not for ELG monitoring, only for benchmark monitoring. And that's called additional implementation measures, or AIM, because EPA loves acronyms. So for AIM to be triggered, there are two conditions that could occur, and that is the exceedance of your 4 quarterly average for a parameter under benchmark monitoring, or if fewer than 4 quarters are sampled, if fewer than 4 samples are collected, but a single sample or the sum of any sample to date is more than 4 times the parameter. So that basically indicates that an exceedance is mathematically certain. And if any of these conditions occur, then you do need to follow the appropriate AIM level responses and deadlines. And those are detailed out in part 5.2 of the permit. And these actions are potentially ongoing. It depends on what conditions occur and when. So you may need to perform corrective action and implement AIM responses throughout your permit coverage depending on which conditions are triggered and when. So like I said, I'm going to spend a couple slides talking about the additional implementation measures protocol. Under the previous permit, if there was a benchmark exceedance, then operators needed to review their control measures to see if modifications were necessary, and they needed to continue monitoring until there was no exceedance. So it was pretty one-dimensional. You just needed to look at your SWIP, review your control measures, and make changes if you thought they were necessary. So under the new permit, there is a much more robust protocol for follow-up actions for benchmark exceedances. And it's detailed out in these 3 different levels. So the first level, level 1, is very similar to what was required before. So the 2015 MSGP mirrors what level 1 is. So if you're in baseline status, which means you haven't had any exceedances under the permit, and this is the status that everyone starts off in. If you're in baseline status and you have a triggering event or an exceedance, then you need to review your SWIP and your control measures, implement additional measures if necessary, and continue monitoring until there's no exceedance. So like I said, it's very similar to what was required before. If while you're in level 1 and you have this continued monitoring, another triggering event occurs, then you need to implement additional pollution prevention measures and good housekeeping measures and continue monitoring. So at this point in time, it's not optional to implement additional controls. You do need to implement additional controls that are pollution prevention and good housekeeping oriented. Moving on to level 3 means that while you were in level 2, you had another exceedance, another triggering event. And at that point, you do need to install permanent control measures such as structural source and treatment controls. And then you need to continue monitoring until there is no exceedance. So each of these levels, it progresses from baseline status to level 1, level 2, and level 3. And I'm going to talk more about how each of these levels interacts and works and what the different triggers are in the next slide. So there's a lot going on this slide, but let me walk you through it. So this is sort of all of the components of AIM in one graphic. So if you start here at the bottom, like I said, everyone starts off in baseline status. And of course, this only applies if you have benchmark monitoring. So if you're in baseline status and you have a trigger, so all of the triggers are here in green and the responses are in orange, the deadlines in gray, your reset condition, and then your exceptions, which are the same for each level. So if you do have an exceedance, you're in baseline status and your annual average is exceeded, or you have fewer than 4 samples, but the exceedance is certain, that moves you into level 1. And like I said, you need to review your SWIP and your control measures. You need to implement controls, additional controls if necessary, and continue monitoring. And the deadline for that is to implement those additional controls if necessary within 14 days. And if that isn't feasible, then you need to complete it within 45 days. So while you're in level 1, if you do have an exceedance from continued monitoring, then you move up into level 2. So the triggering event is if you're in level 1 and you have an annual average that's exceeded, or fewer than 4 samples, of course, that indicate an exceedance is certain. That's how you move into level 2. The responses for level 2, like I mentioned, you need to implement those pollution prevention and good housekeeping measures and continue monitoring. The deadline is the same as in level 1. And then moving on to level 3, if you are in level 2 and you continue to have an exceedance, you would move into level 3. So the triggering condition is the same. The responses, as I mentioned, are to install the permanent controls and continue monitoring. The deadlines for level 3 are a little bit different. You need to identify the schedule for installing the permanent controls within 14 days, and then install the controls within 60 days. You may be granted up to 90 days, so there is some flexibility in those deadlines. The reset conditions for all of these levels is the same. So, for example, if you're in level 1 and you continue monitoring and you've met all the AIM responses, so you've reviewed your SWIP, you've implemented a control if it was necessary, and your continued monitoring has shown that you don't have an exceedance, well, that means you go back to baseline. And the same reset condition applies to every single level. So if you're in level 2 and your continued monitoring shows that you don't have an exceedance, your continued monitoring shows that you don't have an exceedance, that means you don't go back to level 1, you go back to baseline status. So at any time during each of these levels, if you don't have a four-quarter average exceedance, then you reset back to baseline status. Another thing I wanted to mention is that we have 5 exceptions to AIM. So what that means is that if you meet any of these exceptions, then you don't have to do these responses, even if you have this trigger. So under the proposal, if you were familiar with the proposal, there were certain exceptions for each AIM level. Under the final permit, we've allowed all of those exceptions at any time at any AIM level. So that includes if your exceedance is due to a natural background, if the exceedance is due to a run-on source, if you happen to have a one-time abnormal event, you can have an exception. If you can demonstrate that your discharge does not result in exceedance of water quality standard, and then also if you can demonstrate that you have a site-specific analysis that shows that your exceedances for aluminum and copper actually would not be an exceedance. So this is what I mentioned before when I was talking about updating benchmark values, that we're allowing a site-specific analysis for these type of exceedances for these 2 parameters only. So I know this slide is summarizing a lot of information, and there are conditions that are required for each of these exceptions, which are detailed out in Part 5.2. So a little more about the AIM triggering condition so you can kind of visualize how these different triggers work. I first want to point out, actually over here, that the AIM applies per parameter per discharge point. So, for example, if you have an exceedance of aluminum and you have other benchmark monitoring parameters, AIM doesn't apply to those other parameters if you haven't exceeded them, of course. So it's on a per parameter per discharge point basis. Another key thing that's different from the proposal that we had is that the triggers do not change from AIM level to level. So the trigger is basically the same throughout each level. It's just that if the trigger repeats while you're in that level, then you move up to the next level. So we had a number of different triggers under the proposal, and we've streamlined this basically to one triggering condition that can be expressed in two different ways. Another thing that's different from the proposal is that in the final permit, AIM levels are sequential and cannot be skipped. So you must be in baseline status to move to level 1. You have to be in level 1 to move to level 2, and so on. So you can't go from level 1 to level 3. So you can't escalate the response that's required without having gone through the previous levels. And as I mentioned, all AIM exceptions are available at all AIM levels. So just to detail out the triggering conditions a little bit more, I mentioned that there are these two triggering conditions, but they're mathematically related, and they're basically the same but expressed in two different ways. So the first triggering condition, which I think most folks are familiar with, and both of these were in the previous permit, the 2015 MSGP, is if you have a 4-quarter average that's over the benchmark. So you can see from this graph that over the 4 samples you have, if you average these out, obviously, you're going to have a 4-quarter average at the end of the year that's over the benchmark threshold here. So that would be a triggering condition. Another triggering condition that was in the previous permit that I want folks to be familiar with is if there are fewer than 4 quarters that are sampled, but the sum to date is over 4 times the benchmark. So you can see here that this facility had one sample that was right around the benchmark, but then in their second quarter they had a huge spike, and it's, I don't have numbers on here, but you can see there's a visual representation that it's already 4 times the benchmark value. So even if they had 0 here in 3 and 4 quarters, they would mathematically exceed the benchmark value regardless in their quarter 2 sampling. And this is an important trigger because you don't want to wait, and EPA doesn't want you to wait until this 4th quarter way out here to actually take action to address these exceedances. We need you to take action right away and make sure that you're having timely responses to these exceedances. This indicates there's probably an issue that you need to take care of right now. You don't want to wait another 6 months when you get your 4-quarter average to actually do something about it. So that's why this timely response is a really important component of AIM. So the last part of follow-up that I wanted to talk about is completing reporting. So we have 2 different electronic systems for reporting under this permit. One I've already talked about, which is called the NET MSGP or NPDES e-reporting tool. That's what NET stands for. And like I mentioned, you can submit your NOI there. You can submit your change NOI. If you do meet those conditions for an exclusion from permitting that I talked about very early on for the no exposure certification, you can also submit that in NET MSGP. And don't be confused that this system is called NET MSGP. The no exposure certification is an exclusion, but it is just submitted through this system. It doesn't mean that you'll be covered by the permit. You'll also submit your notice of termination and your annual report, which is due January 30th of each year that you're covered. So don't forget that. Additionally to NET MSGP, not to be confused with NET MSGP, is NET DMR. So that stands for Net Discharge Monitoring Report. So this is where you would submit all of your monitoring data from your benchmark monitoring, your indicator monitoring, ELG monitoring, impaired waters monitoring. All of that data will go into NET DMR. So just make sure that when you get set up for the permit that you get accounts for both of these systems. and I put the website for each of these here. And I'm sure folks are asking if these slides will be available, and the answer is yes, they will be available, so you can have these links right there. These links are also available on our website already, so there's a page dedicated to electronic reporting that you can go to. Remember that this activity is ongoing. It's not a one-and-done thing. You do need to report your monitoring depending on the frequency of your monitoring. So, for example, indicator monitoring for pH, TSS, and COD is quarterly throughout the permit term. For PAHs, it's biannually. For quarterly benchmark monitoring, of course, that's quarterly. Annual ELG monitoring is annually. So depending on what frequency your different types of monitoring are, you will need to report those monitoring data at that frequency. I want to point folks to Appendix O of the permit. It's a summary of all of the permit submissions that are required for this permit. It also summarizes the frequency and the due dates and who it applies to. So this is a really good cheat sheet if you're looking for a nice summary of what reports are required and when under the permit. So I don't have a very exciting slide for parts 8 and part 9, but I do want to make sure to talk about them for a minute. I did mention that these are parts of the permit, so please don't overlook them. Sector-specific requirements are in part 8, so in addition to the main parts of the permit, you may have additional sector-specific requirements or subsector-specific requirements that are detailed out in part 8. Part 8 also includes the specific monitoring that each subsector is required to conduct under the permit, and that's where you're going to find the values that you, like the benchmark monitoring values, the ELG values. Indicator monitoring doesn't have values, but you'll see what applies to your subsector, so make sure you read your respective part in part 8. The other reminder, of course, is to make sure you do check out any state or tribal specific requirements in Part 9. Some areas don't have any requirements. So where it doesn't have any requirements, we've noted that there aren't additional conditions that you need to follow. But make sure you do check this out and comply with those requirements. There are often some submissions that are required to the state or to the tribe. There may be NOI, you need to send your NOI, for example, to the state or tribe at the same time you submit to EPA, things like that. So make sure you're looking at this section and complying with those requirements as well. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we are doing some implementation assistance at the onset of the effective date of this permit. In addition to this webinar, we are hosting a second webinar in 2 weeks on March 4th. So if any of your colleagues or friends were not able to register for this webinar because we were at capacity, we did set up a second webinar for the same time period on March 4th, Thursday, 2 weeks from now. So that registration is now open on our website. So if you attended this presentation, it's going to cover the same content, but we encourage you to let your colleagues know or friends know that did not get registered for this webinar to register for that one. In addition, we are working on updating the SWIP template and the SWIP guide. The SWIP template does not have to be used, but it does kind of outline the key elements that are required in the permit, so you may use this. I understand we have a lot of existing permittees, so you may not need to use the template. You already have existing SWIPs, so you'll just need to update them per Part 6. So you're just going to want to look at the permit, make sure your SWIP already includes everything that's required, and if there's anything new, then just make sure to update the SWIP that you already have. There's also a monitoring and sampling guide that we're updating. Also documentation templates for monitoring, inspections, evaluations, and corrective actions. There's a no exposure guide if you're one of those facilities that is qualifying for the no exposure certification. Also developing a more robust FAQ to go on our website. And also for the new additional implementation measures, we're developing a spreadsheet to help identify if a benchmark exceedance has occurred. So it's going to be a simple, user-friendly spreadsheet that you can go in and enter your values ahead of when you need to submit them in NetDMR. So this would be done sort of in real time. You can use it to enter in your monitoring data, and it will do some calculations for you and show you if you have an exceedance or not. That way you can know if you're in an AIM level right away and take that action in the required time frame. Everything is on our website. We have a guidance tab on our website, so make sure to check that out. We're going to try to update all of these within the next couple of weeks to next couple months, and we'll keep everyone posted when those things do go online. So continually check the website for those updated guidance documents. So again, where can you find the permit and the rest of the record? The permit documents are posted on our webpage here, and the docket is the public domain where all of the permit documents and the rest of our record for this action is included. So that includes the response to comments. And this docket is already there for the proposal, but it will update with new documents for the final action, the final permit, I believe tomorrow when the Federal Register notice publishes. So if you're looking at it now, there isn't anything new on there from the proposal, but if you check it out tomorrow or early next week, it should be updated with all of the new documents on there. And with that, I see we're about at 2:20. And we have plenty of time for Q&A, so I'm going to pause and take a drink of water, and then I think Rachel and I are going to volley some Q&A for the rest of the session. So Rachel, if you want to go ahead and get started with the first question, and we can go from there.
Sure thing. So we did get a number of questions, so we can go ahead and try to answer as many as we can. While Emily is getting a sip of water, I presume, I'll kind of ask an easier one for you, Emily, first. When do you plan to post the webinar and the slides on the website?
That's a good question. I don't have an exact time frame, but we need to be able to process the webinar since we are recording it, and then we'll get it posted as soon as possible. So I expect within a week or two we'll have it posted on the website. And that's this website here that's on the slide right now.
Great, thank you. I have a couple questions that came in related to existing versus new facilities. If you are an existing facility that has never had MSGP coverage, are you considered a new facility under the permit?
Yes. Because an existing facility is defined as a facility that has or had 2015 MSGP coverage. So existing is sort of a misnomer. Even if you're like existing in real life, existing in this context means you had coverage before. So if you were operating without a permit, you would need to meet the deadline of a new facility. In fact, you should probably get your NOI in as soon as possible since you are discharging without a permit, but you wouldn't have that grace period until May 30th. You would need to act as if you were a new facility if you haven't had permit coverage before.
Okay, and another question, if a facility is currently operating under an intent to operate, or an ITO, is it considered an existing or a new facility for the 2021 MSGP purpose?
So for those facilities, and I know we have a number of them that began discharging after the 2015 MSGP expired, you're what we're calling the ITO facilities. So you're in this sort of middle ground where you had the ITO and you submitted that to EPA, and now you need to get NOI coverage. So that we put you guys in the category of existing facilities. As long as you follow the procedures of submitting the ITO and you were complying with the 2015 MSGP, which was expired. As long as you are doing that, then you can be in the category of existing facilities. And our no action assurance memo, which basically says that if you are following those procedures, EPA won't take action against you for discharging without a permit, because it's our, it was our responsibility to reissue the permit on time, and we didn't. So we issued this no action assurance memo. That covers you until, I believe, the end of April. Or actually the end of June, I believe it got extended. So you are under the category of existing facilities and will have the same amount of time as an existing facility that had an NOI if you have an ITO.
Great, thank you. The next set of questions are related to some clarifications related to notice of intent or no exposure certification. So is this electronic system available at this time to view for the submittal of the NOIs?
No, the electronic system is not yet available. Existing facilities can go in and they'll see their dashboard, but you can't yet submit a new NOI, and that's because the permit isn't effective yet. So we can't open up the new NOI until March 1st. So once March 1st turns around, you will be able to go into Net MSGP and start filling out your NOI. And what we tried to do this time is make it really easy for existing facilities and even facilities with an ITO. So you'll be able to actually transfer all of your data from your old NOI to a new NOI, or your ITO to a new NOI. You will need to look it over and make sure every field is filled out, because there are some new fields, but you'll be able to kind of like transfer everything over from your old form to the new form, which should streamline everything and make things a little less time consuming. So come March 1st, that function will be available in Net MSGP.
Great, thanks. Another question that we received from a few people is related to the NPDES IDs. So people are wondering if the NPDES ID will be the same as the existing NPDES ID for facilities that would be continuing coverage. And it seems like the question is related in part to the public signage requirement, since people are indicating that they're starting to work on developing their sign and they don't want to put the wrong ID on there.
That's a really good question, and the answer is yes, the NPDES ID will remain the same. So you will have the same NPDES ID that you had before. We're transferring over all of the NPDES IDs and hope to maintain that, so you kind of stick with the same number as long as you're operating under the permit.
I'm sure a couple people are breathing a sigh of relief with that answer. Another question, for existing facilities submitting an NOI by May 30th, does the permit become effective March 1st or sometime after the NOI is submitted?
Yeah, that's a good clarification that I'll make. So because this is a general permit, that means that the permit is sort of out there and it's available March 1st. But for your individual facility, you have to submit a notice of intent under the permit. And just because the permit is effective, that means it's like effective and available starting March 1st for NOIs to be submitted. But once you complete and submit your NOI, there is a 30 to 60-day authorization wait time for review by EPA and other federal agencies. Once that time period is over, you'll receive an authorization email saying your individual facility is now authorized for discharges. So the timeline for the permit effective date is different from the authorization timeline for your individual facility. That depends on when you submit your NOI and when your authorization goes through. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, I think you did. The next couple are related to the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, related to the three options for inclusion in the NOI. So one person is wondering, is making the, or posting the SWIP for the public, Is that a requirement only for new facilities?
No, the public availability requirement of the SWIP applies to everyone. It is a carryover requirement from the previous permit. Under the 2015 MSGP, all facilities had to either put a URL if they posted their own SWIP, like on their company website, in the NOI, or they had to put pertinent information that was extracted from their SWIP in their NOI. This time around, we have a third option, which we hope could streamline things for a couple folks, is that you can attach like a PDF of your SWIP directly to the NOI in that MSGP. So this requirement does apply to everyone, not just new facilities, but you do have the option to one of those three options to make it publicly available. And if you did something before and you want to do something different now, you can certainly do that. Or if you decide halfway through your permit coverage that, you know what, I actually do want to post my SWIP on a URL, I think that's easier and more effective and more cost effective for me, you can do that. So you can always go in and submit a change NOI and change the method by which you make your SWIP publicly available.
Great. And another follow-up question is, for those SWIPs that are submitted along with the notice of intent, what happens if the plan is updated? Do they have to submit all of the plan changes?
I believe that we have certain deadlines in the SWIP section, so there are things that do need to be updated on a regular basis. And if your SWIP changes, then you do need to, update your SWIP. I believe it's, I have to check on the requirement. I can't remember if it's after quarterly inspections or it's before your annual report, but there is a requirement in the permit that the SWIP does get updated, whether you attach it or whether you put a URL in the NOI specifically, or even if you extract information, you'll have to keep that updated on a regular basis. I can't remember the frequency right now, but it does need to be updated when the SWIP changes.
Okay, great. The next question is changing gears just a little bit. Do you have to post a public sign if the facility has submitted a no exposure certification?
That's a good question. No, you do not. Like I said, the no exposure certification is an exclusion from permitting. So all of the requirements that I talked about today are for those facilities that are covered by the permit. If you have a no exposure exclusion, all you need to do is, of course, make sure you're eligible and then submit your no exposure certification and keep that in your records. You don't have to do anything additional that's discussed under the permit. And you do not have to post a sign.
Okay, great. I'm going to switch over to some questions related to monitoring now. So first one is, what happens if no discharge occurs in a quarter during the first year you are monitoring so that it interrupts the consecutive monitoring schedule?
So if you don't have any discharges, you do need to document that. And there is a way in that DMR to submit a no data code. It's called a no-D code. So you can notate that you didn't have a discharge to collect monitoring data for those quarters. And then you would need to, you would still need to complete those samples once there was a discharge. The frequency isn't necessarily affected by the previous monitoring period. So when I talk about years 1 and 4, regardless of if you if you had an exceedance in year 1 of your permit coverage, you would still need to monitor again in year 4. So even if your monitoring moves back because you couldn't collect samples and you still need to collect those samples, if you do that in your second year of permit coverage and you don't have an exceedance, for example, you would have like 1 year off and then you would have the 4th year come again. So it doesn't necessarily shift everything back. It's kind of static where it's like your first year and your 4th year. So it's not sort of like contingent upon like when you have that monitoring in the first year. It's your first year of permit coverage and then your fourth year of permit coverage. It doesn't kind of move everything back on a sliding scale between those two periods.
Okay, and another question that's related to indicator monitoring specifically. Do facilities report indicator monitoring findings in NetDMR?
Yes, you will need to report indicator monitoring in NetDMR. I know a lot of folks that didn't have monitoring before under the previous permit who now have indicator monitoring will need to get accustomed with NetDMR, and we're committed to helping all of those operators get the assistance they need to make sure they get registered and logged in and make sure they have an account and make sure they understand like how to submit data. We do have a help desk. We have the team here. You also have your regional contacts. So there are plenty of resources. We encourage folks, to get set up in there as early as they can and make sure they understand how to use the system. So we, short answer, yes, indicator monitoring does need to come in NetDMR, but we do recognize that this will be something new for a lot of facilities under our permit, but we're here and we're here to help you through that.
Okay, a question that is related to co-located industrial activities. So the question says, it appears that the indicator monitoring for TSS, COD, and pH primarily applies to facilities that don't have sector-based benchmark monitoring. But if you have co-located industrial activities and at least one has sector benchmark requirements, do you still have to do the indicator monitoring?
I think that I'll have to think about that and look into that a little bit more, unless Rachel, off the top of your head.
I think if the co-located activities is in two different sectors, and they have to I assume they'd fulfill the requirement for each sector. So that if they had benchmark monitoring for one, they would fulfill that. If they had indicator monitoring for another, they would fulfill that.
Yeah, I do think that's right. I'll look into that a little bit more, but I think that having that benchmark monitoring for a co-located activity doesn't preclude you from fulfilling your requirements for your other subsector or your other sector for indicator monitoring.
Okay, and then there's a question related to pH under indicator monitoring. Where the person is asking, is it required that they get their pH data results from the analytical lab, or is field instrumentation okay?
I believe field instrumentation is okay for that.
Great, and then switching to PAH monitoring for sectors with newly added PAH monitoring. If you are not currently and do not plan to use coal tar sealant in the future, the PAH monitoring does not apply, correct? Do we need to include a note about not using sealants in our SWIP?
The answer to that is correct. So if you the way the requirement is phrased, if you've taken a look at it in the permit, is if you will use coal tar seal coat to seal or reseal during your permit coverage, then this monitoring would apply. So if you don't plan to use it to seal or reseal, then the monitoring would not apply. And the way we determine that is there's a question in the NOI that will ask you that. So you can say no. And if you say no, then the monitoring won't apply. So that's where it will indicate in the record that you won't be using those coal tar seal coats. And while we're talking about that, I want to make sure that we clarify that this doesn't apply retroactively. So if you have used coal tar seal coat in the past on your paved surfaces where your industrial activities occur, this requirement doesn't apply to you retroactively. So if you've used it in the past, you know, that's not what triggers this. It's triggered is once you get permit coverage, will you use it or reuse it to reseal your pavement? So that's how the condition applies. To answer if you should note it in your SWIP or not, you know, by all means, I usually encourage people to over-document things, but you will have it indicated on your NOI because it is a question, and you have to have your NOI with your NOI record with your SWIP. So it will be in there somewhere, but obviously feel free to notate, you know, in that section that, you know, this requirement does not apply to you because you're not using these types of seal codes.
Okay, thank you. I'll move into a couple questions related to benchmark monitoring. If you did benchmark monitoring under the 2015 permit, do you have to do it again? Same question for impaired pollution.
Yes. So the previous permit is its own permit and it's now expired. So this is a new permit and the requirements restart. So even if you did benchmark monitoring under the previous permit, you will need to do it again under this permit. So facilities that are subject to benchmark monitoring, your monitoring for benchmark starts in that first year of permit coverage. So that will be in your first full quarter after you get covered for those 4 quarters. So it will start, you know, shortly after you get covered by the permit. So you will need to conduct it again under this permit.
Okay, and then a question related to discharge points and benchmark monitoring. Is the average benchmark value calculated for each discharge point or for all discharge points?
It's done by discharge point, but this is a good opportunity to talk about substantially identical discharge points. You also may remember them as substantially identical outfalls or SIOs. So we're moving away from the term outfall for this permit, so we have just substantially identical discharge points. So if you do have substantially identical discharge points, then you don't need to conduct monitoring for all of them. You can have, you know, one discharge point that's representative of the other discharge points, and there is, you know, there's some conditions that, you know, you have to have the same type of activity, the same discharge, effluent, you know, quality from those discharge points to have them be substantially identical. So even though monitoring is per discharge point, you can, you know, group similar discharge points and only monitor for one if you have a representative one, and you would only need to report data for that one main discharge point and indicate all the rest are substantially identical discharge points.
Okay, and then another question related to discharge points as well. Asks, if you are below the benchmark values in the first 4 quarters for some discharge points, but not others, can you discontinue the benchmark monitoring for the discharge points that you do not meet the benchmark thresholds for until year 4? I guess it's asking what happens if some of your discharge points are below the benchmark value and some are above in terms of the monitoring schedule.
Okay, yeah, so, you know, it does apply on a per parameter basis. So if you have completed monitoring, benchmark monitoring for some, but not all, you know, you don't have to continue monitoring for those parameters in which your benchmark threshold was under, but you will need to continue monitoring for those which were over. So, for example, if you had TSS that was under for the first 4 quarters, you could discontinue monitoring that one until year 4. But if you had aluminum, which was over, you would need to keep monitoring that one. And say in, you know, year 2 of monitoring, you had an annual average that was under, you could discontinue that one. But again, until year 4, where all benchmark monitoring, regardless of if you have an exceedance or not, would need to restart for 4 quarters.
Thanks. The next question is, Are AIM deadlines measured from the date of knowing, in effect, the receipt of analytical results?
Yes. So once you get your lab results, that's when as soon as you know that what your results are, that's when the deadline would start. So you're counting from the day that you have that information that you have an exceedance.
Okay, and then someone asked for a clarification. Can you confirm that the 4-sample annual average exceedance or annual average calculation doesn't necessarily correlate to a calendar year average? Please confirm that it is a rolling average of 4-sample calculation.
So the 4-quarter average is not a rolling average. So it is a 4-quarter average. So for example, like you start your monitoring in quarter 2, you have quarter 2, 3, 4, and then quarter 1 of the following calendar year. Those are your 4 quarters. And that's where your average is. If you have an exceedance at that point, you start over. So you would start again in quarter 2 of that next year to restart your quarterly monitoring. So you wouldn't then average the previous 3 quarters into your average again. So you need to start over to get those 4 consecutive quarters once you've had an exceedance.
Okay, thank you. Can you clarify the impaired waters monitoring requirement again? Do we need to continue monitoring once per year if detected in the first year?
Yeah, let me go back to that slide. It might help.
And then, Emily, a follow-up, since it's similar in nature, was can you review the conditions for which impaired waters monitoring applies in year 4? So maybe if you could just kind of discuss that impaired waters monitoring a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I can go over this again. So I definitely recommend that you read this part of the permit because it details out probably better than I can summarize in this little box on the slide. But basically think of it as you have there are 2 monitoring years, and each of the monitoring years has a different set of pollutants. The first year is similar to what you might have been used to under the previous permit. So in your first year of permit coverage, you need to monitor for all pollutants causing the impairment. And this is a list that's generated when you submit your NOI. You select your receiving water, and there's a database that's connected to the NOI system where it will pull the pollutants causing the impairment for you. So that will be the one that it will tell you which ones that are causing the impairment. So those will be your monitored pollutants. So it's a comprehensive list in the first year. And this is to make sure that, you may not be contributing to all of these impairments, but we want to make sure. So we need to, facilities need to monitor for all pollutants causing the impairments in that first year. So say after the first year, you don't detect any pollutants that are causing the impairment. What that means is you can discontinue monitoring until the 4th year of your permit coverage. And in the 4th year of permit coverage, you'll need to conduct annual monitoring again. Remember, these are only annual samples, so 1 sample a year. So if you didn't have any pollutants that were detected after the first year, you can discontinue monitoring until the 4th year, where you have to take 1 sample again. But you will only need to get a laboratory analysis for the pollutants that are causing impairment but are only associated with your industrial activity or are your benchmark. So it's a subset of the pollutants that you looked at in the first year. And if you don't detect them again, you can discontinue monitoring for the remainder of your permit coverage. So alternatively, if you did detect a pollutant in the first year of permit coverage, you would need to keep monitoring for it through that second year. And in the second year, if you didn't detect it, you can discontinue until the 4th year. But in the second year, if you did detect it, you would monitor again in the third year. And that would sort of segue into the fourth year anyway. So you're kind of monitoring from year 1 to year 4 in that scenario. So, you know, in the example where you monitored for that pollutant in year 2 and you didn't detect it then, maybe because you increased your controls or you had some new treatment to control that pollutant and you didn't detect it in your discharge, you could discontinue monitoring at that point until year 4. And if it was a pollutant that was associated with your industrial activity and was a benchmark and was causing the impairment, you would need to keep monitoring for it then. So after the 4th year, it's sort of the same logic that applies. If you didn't detect it, then you can discontinue. But if you did, you would need to keep monitoring for it, presumably through the end of the permit term, because you're coming up on your 5th year there. So that's sort of how that works. It's the same sort of idea with the benchmark monitoring, where if it's not detected, you can discontinue until this sort of second round of monitoring in the latter half of the permit. But each of these for impaired waters has the first year is a more comprehensive list of impairments, and then the 4th year is a subset of pollutants that you need to monitor for. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and there's a couple other questions as well. Is the impaired waters monitoring requirement based on a direct discharge into an impaired water? What if the facility discharges through an MS4?
Well, the discharge is, even discharges through an MS4 end up in a water body. So if the first water body to which the MS4 to which you discharge is an impaired water, then impaired water monitoring would still apply.
Okay, great, thank you. And then someone else was asking about you mentioning a list of pollutants causing impairments is generated when you submit your notice of intent. Is it possible to access this list before submitting the notice of intent to help assist with SWIP development?
It is possible to obtain the list of impairments. The database that I'm referring to is called ATTAINS. It's ATTAINS. And then also, depending on the water body that you discharge to, your state maintains, those impairments. And you may need to contact your state. You may need to search for it, but there is data out there on the water body if it is impaired and what those impairments are. So there are different assessments that are conducted on impaired water bodies that you could find if you needed and wanted to look for that prior to getting into net MSGP to see what those impairments are through the submission of your NOI.
Okay, thanks. And then switching gears, is an annual report required if the facility has submitted a no exposure certification?
No. Like I mentioned before, the no exposure is an exclusion, so the requirement to submit an annual report doesn't apply. The only thing that no exposure facilities need to do is, importantly, if you no longer meet the conditions for no exposure, you will need to get covered by the permit. So if for some reason, things change at your facility and you no longer are eligible, you immediately do need to get covered by the permit. But as long as you maintain those no exposure conditions, the rest of the permit requirements do not apply to you, including submitting an annual report.
And another question related to no exposure. Did EPA make any changes to the criteria used for the no exposure?
No, the no exposure conditions are set forth in the regulations. So as part of the reissuance of this permit, those conditions aren't part of it. Those are set forth in the regulations, and that's what our no exposure certification is based on. So they did not change with the reissuance of this permit.
Okay, great, thank you. And a question about changing name changes. If a company has had a name change, and that's the only change is to the name, not the change in the operations or the location, does one need to submit a notice of termination for the old company name and then a new NOI under the new name?
So if you have a name change to your facility and you're not actually changing operators, you don't need to submit a notice of termination and resubmit. I need to check, but you may need to work with your region to actually make that change, because the name field on the NOI is usually locked, because our requirement under this permit is that if you change operators, like actual operators, then you do need to terminate your coverage, and the new operator needs to submit a new NOI. So the name is locked for that purpose. But if it is truly like a legal name change of your company or name change of your operation, that can be done without submitting an NOT and like resubmitting your NOI. You would just need to contact your regional MSGP coordinator, and that can be done via email or phone call. Just explain the situation, because that does come up. I don't think that you can submit a change NOI. You may be able to, and the region needs to approve it or something like that. I can't remember the protocol, but I know it is possible, and it can be done fairly easily.
And I guess a similar question that also came in is, but slightly different. This is related to ownership though. Late in 2015, the facility's ownership changed. Will that NOI be able to be transferred to a new owner under the new MSGP?
No, so that's what I was just talking about. If you actually have a new owner, then a new NOI needs to be submitted. We don't have this concept of transfer of coverage under this permit. Some states may have that, but under EPA's permit, we don't have a transfer of coverage. So if you're the old operator, you need to submit a notice of termination, and the new operator needs to submit a new NOI, and submit it under their the new name of the facility, because under this permit, it's not the facility technically that's permitted, it's the operator. And so when there is a change in operator, the new operator needs to be permitted separately. So hope that helps with that.
Yes. And then someone was asking if they attach this, so I'm switching back to the NOI. If someone attaches the SWIP as a PDF in the electronic system, what link would they then be using for the public signage piece? Since they're attaching a PDF.
Oh yes. So there are two options in the permit for the signage. Let me just get back to the example. And I used one example, but make sure you look at the two different options in the permit. So for my sign, I had shown that I had posted my SWIP on a URL. But if you don't post your SWIP on a URL and say you attach it to your NOI, as in the questioner's example, there's language in the permit in part 135 that instead of putting the URL, you would put the name of, you basically modify this sentence here to say, to obtain a copy of the SWIP or report observed indicators of stormwater pollution, contact EPA. So you would put the name of, you just modify this sentence, and then you wouldn't have this URL here. So there's flexibility depending on how you want to indicate how to obtain your SWIP. So you don't have to do it this way. If you don't have a URL online, you can just say, hey, contact EPA. EPA can get my SWIP if you prefer to do it that way. But some folks want to have their URL there for their SWIP, so there's different options under this requirement for that.
Thank you. I think Let's see, another question that we have is, I know we're starting to run low on time, so I'm going to pick a couple more. Some states require data to be submitted to them. If data is submitted in EPA's electronic system, will it be automatically transferred to states?
The answer is no, unfortunately. I wish we were all coordinated well enough to do that. So if there is data that's required under Part 9 of the permit for your specific state, you will need to send that data to them separately, and they may have instructions in Part 9 about how to do that. You know, they may have an email address or an address or some sort of submission process for that data. So make sure to check that out, and you know, you would need to comply with those submission requirements if it existed.
Okay. Whoops, sorry, I accidentally unmuted myself incorrectly. Another question relates to Idaho. When the permit is transferred to Idaho, I assume that's talking about the transfer of the permitting authority. Will the annual reports be submitted to Idaho beginning in January 2022? How will all of this transfer?
Yeah, and Alicia talked about this when, you know, she was going over the areas. You know, Idaho will assume NPDES permitting authority for industrial stormwater discharges in July. And we're going to work closely with the state and with those operators. I believe that operators will still be covered under net MSGP. Not a whole lot's going to change with their coverage status, just in terms of the system and where they need to submit. I believe Idaho is still going to use net MSGP, and so we'll work closely with those operators. But I believe everything will still be submitted in net MSGP. It will just go to a different permitting authority, which will be Idaho at that time. So yeah, you at that time when the annual report is due, it will be submitted to Idaho. You know, everything after July will be submitted to Idaho, but I believe it will be all through that MSGP, so everything should be fairly seamless. But as that date gets closer, I don't want operators in Idaho to worry. We will work with you closely, and we will get you all the information that's needed, to make sure that your coverage is seamless between the two permitting authorities. So.
And then Emily, I know we got a couple questions about where the permit applies. Can you just reiterate what section of the permit the areas of coverage are listed?
Yes, those are in Appendix C. So let me go back to the map. So this is a very general map of where the permit applies, but in Appendix C of the permit is where it details out the very specific areas where the permit applies. So, for the Indian country lands, for all of the territories, there's a very specific description of where the permit applies. But generally, it's in these 4 states: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New Mexico, and Idaho. And Idaho will be until July of this year, like we just mentioned. Most Indian country lands, so if your facility is going to be on Indian country lands, you're going to be covered by EPA's permit. Even if you're in, say, Virginia, or California, that has its own MSGP. If your facility is Indian country land, you're under EPA's MSGP, not the state MSGP. So I know that's a little confusing. So make sure you know that difference about which permit, you need to be covered under. And then, like I said, a lot of the territories and federal facilities in these 4 states, Washington, Colorado, Vermont, and Delaware, and then very specific oil and gas activities in Oklahoma and Texas. So all of these are detailed out in Appendix C of the permit.
Great, thank you. And then I know we have less than a minute left, so I'm going to give you one last question that I think is just a point of clarification, and I think it's related to slide 13, if I'm not mistaken. At the beginning of the presentation, the slide proposed permit changes that were not finalized as proposed in the 2021 MSGP. Can you clarify what this means? Does it mean that these 8 bullets were considered during review of updates to the permit, but not implemented and not required under the final permit?
Yes, that's correct. So I wanted to include this slide in case folks are wondering, because a lot of these got a lot of attention and comments during the proposal. So all of these bullets here are not included in the final permit, and they are not requirements in the final permit. They were considered in various capacities in the proposal, and based on public comments, we decided not to move forward with them as proposed in the final permit.
Great, thank you. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and conclude today's webinar. We want to thank everyone for attending today. And as a reminder, the webinar will be posted on our EPA Industrial Stormwater webpage as soon as possible, and at that link that Emily had on the slide that was largely up most of the time. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.